Okay, Wesch 6 Part 7. I'm having all kinds of issues with my YouTube account right now, but hopefully it's getting sorted out. Uh, if you have trouble with one of the videos, just shoot me an email and we'll work it out. So, Sherry Ortner, looking at and listening to real people doing real things and trying to figure out how they are doing or have done will or will not reconfigure the world they live in. That's what we're doing. So people are actually um, doing things that they weren't doing 10 years ago or 15 years ago in terms of gender. So we just have to learn from them and see what they're doing. This is empirical science here. This is not prescriptive science. This is descriptive. We're describing what people are doing, not prescribing what they should be doing in anthropology. So, how do people actively live within the world's cultural constraints? When and how do people recreate those constraints? When and how do people change those constraints? Field observation. In your uncomfortable experience, did you find any constraints in watching your videos, your movies? How? Why? What it would have happened if you had challenged them? And here I was thinking if you had been in a church or something like that, and everyone was kneeling, and you had decided not to kneel, you're going to get looked at, right? And so it's uncomfortable to challenge. Remember this when people are um, um, living out their gender identity and expression. It's not something that is fun to do. It's something that they are compelled to do, but it doesn't make them feel good very often. um, kind of like not doing what everyone else is doing is a little uncomfortable. So those countries with more traditional views of gender have less gender inequality. Really? I don't know. Gender inequality. Uh, anyway, we shall see. Race is a cultural construction. Globally and biologically, race is a myth in the same way that gender is, well, I don't know, gender, biologically a myth, but definitely globally that there's single genders. Definitely, race does not exist. The old races of man, in quotes, Negroid, Caucasoid, American, and Mongoloid, um, are totally bogus and have no basis in biology or genetics. There is more variation among populations in Africa or Europe. You take a random African, you take a random African from another part of the continent, and there's more difference between them than there is between all of the Africans put together and all of the Europeans put together. Those two samples will be much more close. Um, the Homo genus originated in Africa over 2 million years ago. So most genetic diversity exists in Africa. In fact, purely on the basis of genetics, there are three distinct varieties of human being in southern Africa, a fourth in the rest of Africa, and a fifth variety encompassing all human beings everywhere else, from Alaska to um, South America to India to China to Indonesia to uh, everywhere else, Europe and Russia and Norway. All just that fifth variety. Variations in skin color cannot be neatly categorized with other traits, so the genetic coding for skin color, the genetic coding for hair texture, for eye color, for shapes of facial features, etc., these are all very complex. The features don't work together like that. It's not that there's one switch that produces all of those features at once. They're all independent. Race does exist, however. Race does exist, right? In the same way that money exists. You say, oh, money is only a cultural construction, therefore it's totally meaningless. No, actually, money is gonna change your life, and race will as well. Race is very, very real as a social category that's based on physical appearance. So genotype, if you're looking at genetics, genotype is what is coded in the genes and gets passed on. I am bald, but I may pass on genes to my children that don't include male pattern baldness, and that would be wonderful. Uh, there's a genotype in there that contradicts the whatever you see here. But there's a phenotype as well, and the phenotype is bald. So even though I may have genes for that counteract male pattern baldness, what got expressed in my body right now, um, my genome was male pattern baldness. So that's my phenotype, and that's what gets expressed in a particular individual person. So much is hidden in genotype, that is recessive genes, that never gets expressed phenotypically in the dominant genes. This is important to remember, that what we look like is not necessarily what our genes are coding for. So that's why we don't say that physical appearance is really that important biologically, because physical appearance varies as to which sort of roll of the dice came up when your genes decided to recombine. But there's a lot there that isn't expressed, that is still there, that is still scientifically present. So race does exist, based on phenotype, on what people look like. That's how they get sorted into those categories by other people socially in a social process. Slavery created race in the Americas in order to facilitate inequality. Basically, as long as both black people and white people could be enslaved, it was hard to tell at a glance whether you were looking at a slave. Once they said, okay, only blacks can be enslaved, then boom, you see someone, they have brown skin, you immediately think, aha, I need to scrutinize this person and find out if they're free or enslaved. Um, so that was the whole point. Back in the day, and eventually it became synonymous. And so, even though there were plenty of free black people, um, and even after, right after slavery, so even though there's free black people during slavery, they were always under constant threat of being kidnapped and sold into slavery. But then afterwards, after slavery ends in 1865, it's not for another 30 years that you get Jim Crow. Jim Crow, 1898. Prior to that, it was illegal to discriminate between American citizens. You know, what color they were, it doesn't matter. You can't do that to them. But after Plessy v. Ferguson in 1898, then all of a sudden, whoa, you can. Wow. So now it's not just black people who are enslaved being under threat, it's all black people. So it became a much more racist country after 1898, even though slavery was 30 years in the history, 30 plus years in history. Race continued to grow, racism continued to grow and take on a life of its own, outliving slavery due to inequalities in the 20th and the 21st centuries. It continues today, where people are prejudged and then discriminated against on the basis of their on their appearance, on their physical appearance. These inequalities, in turn, have reproduced race biologically. So there are unequal health outcomes, where different racial groups are at much higher risk, um, due to racism, and then also economically. So family wealth. Check this one out. The wealth gap between whites and minorities. See if this will pop up. There it comes. Uh, this has to do with housing. So between the 1930s and the 1970s, if you wanted to buy a house, and you didn't have a 20% down payment, so you want to buy um, a $200,000 home, you got to have 40,000 cash on the barrel or in equity. You got to have that money in order to buy that house. If you don't have $40,000, then you have to get insurance, and insurance is expensive. But if you are white, you get the Federal Housing Administration to pay the insurance. And if you are non-white between the 1930s and the 1970s, sorry, there's no federal housing insurance available to you. Even though this is 1960s and 70s. This is post Brown versus Board of Education. It's this such discrimination is illegal, but it was still legal. It was still being done. And so what that meant was, uh, um, today, so in the 50s and 60s, there was incredible redistribution of wealth. The wages were high. You had people doing skilled labor making $50 an hour. Assembling cars, making twice what I make today. 100,000 plus, in today's money. And so yeah, they bought houses, and if they were white, they went ahead and bought houses because they didn't have any savings, of course, because they just had income. They didn't have wealth, um, but they were able to put that wealth into a house back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, such that by 83, the average white family has $100,000 in wealth, and the average black family has $10,000. And so 2013, 30 years later, the white family's wealth has gone up to 141, and the black family has gone up to 11. Okay, so and Hispanic has gone up to 13. So this is evidence of basically family wealth that represents home ownership, right? This is a house. This is a very modest home in America today. I think the average house is probably 220,000. So 141 is not, is not like a really fancy house, but it is a house, and it has very very real outcomes to have access to that kind of wealth. No, you're not rich, but if you need $10,000 tomorrow, or within a couple weeks, you got a couple weeks, you can come up with $10,000, $15,000 because you have access to a home equity line of credit that these people do not. There's no way they can raise $10,000 uh, without, that'd be all their wealth, right? That'd be it. You'd be spending your nest egg that you've spent your whole life building up, um, to bail someone out of jail or something like that, or pay for a lawyer.